Hi, I'm Matteo Lana, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tiny Boot Studios. Together with my friend Rocco, I founded the studio back in 2013, and ever since then we always wanted to create narrative experiences for our players. We've always liked narrative games, even as kids, and so we decided we wanted to create the same type of experiences. Over the years, we've been working on some work for hire projects to sustain the studio. And in the meantime, we were able to release a couple of our own games, and they all have the same strong narrative feel. The first game we released was Omen Exitio Play. We released it in March 2018, and it is a choose-your-own-adventure game based on the game books from the 80s and 90s. We were pretty much nerds when we were kids, so we really liked those kind of books where you read the story and you chose whether to perform some action or another, and depending on your choices, the story would change and you would get to different endings. So what we wanted to do was try and make something like that, but using digital technology. The other game we released in 2018, in September, was called Blind, and it's a VR psychological thriller adventure for PC and PlayStation 4. In Blind, you play as a girl who finds herself blind after a car accident and has to navigate a weird house using echolocation, so just with sound, while discovering something about her past and trying to solve some puzzles and some mysteries as to how she got there and how she can escape. We are currently working on several more games that are strongly narrative, but more about that later. Now, I want to talk about Omen Exitio Play a bit. Omen Exitio was an interesting project because it was born as a side project, basically, because while we were working on Blind, we had quite a big team, actually, quite a few people coming and going. At a certain point, we reached about 20-something people in our team. But there wasn't necessarily a lot to do for everyone all the time. So we thought we could dedicate a few resources to a side project to try and do something else. That's also because Blind had been going on for about 3 years at the time, 2.5 years. So we also wanted to do something a bit different. So we decided to try and do something simple. We later found out that creating a digital game book is not that simple. But the idea was to create something that didn't require too much graphics, too much interaction, too much gameplay, but where a good story would be enough to entertain the players. So what we did was basically create a story with choices and a branching narrative and multiple endings. Then we added a few other features. We thought that just a story probably wouldn't have been enough, so we decided to add some RPG elements. So the main character of the story has a character sheet with some abilities, some stats. Depending on the choices that you make during the game, you can gain some experience points that then you can spend to enhance your abilities. You will not have enough experience points to get the maximum level for all the abilities, so you have to choose the gameplay style that you want to use. There's fighting, there's observation, medicine, speechcraft. So depending on your style and how you want to play the game, it will play out quite differently depending on the abilities you choose to improve. Other elements we wanted to add to give some more interaction were a map, an interactive map where you could choose where to go at a certain point, depending on where you got to the story. some choices would be made on a map rather than just on the book. And we also added stuff like, well, regular RPG stuff, an inventory, some notes, a recap of the story so far, and stuff like that. Now, the problem here was, how do we engage the player with a simple branching narrative story and keep them entertained, and also give them the impression of actually changing the story with their choices? Now, that's something that other games have tried to do in the past. Most notoriously, games like Life is Strange or pretty much any of the Telltale games try to do the same thing. You basically have a story that is not entirely linear, but you have choices that you can make, and depending on the choices, the story unfolds a bit differently. The idea is to have an underground organization that is kind of pulling the strings from the dark, so controlling the fate of humanity since ancient times. And what this poor protagonist, Jake, has to try to do is foil their plans somehow. He finds himself into this whole mess unwillingly, of course, and he has to do something about that. So this will take him all around the world, traveling to many countries and meeting a lot of people. And what we wanted to do was make it believable and be historically accurate. Not just because we were afraid that people would point out our mistakes, which I'm pretty sure some people would have done, because our target players are kind of like that, probably. But also for us, because we could have taken some artistic license here and there, for sure. But we would have known. We would have known that we were lying and we were making stuff up. And we didn't want to do that. So what we decided to do instead was do a lot of research. And that brought us to some weird places of the internet. For example, we found out, we learned a lot about the Anglo-Zanzibar War, which is right at the beginning of the game, and it took us quite a while to actually portray in a realistic manner. The interesting thing about the Anglo-Zanzibar War is that it lasted about 38 minutes. Basically, a new ruler had taken over Zanzibar, and they wanted independence from Britain, and of course the Queen was not okay with that. So basically they sent an army with a few ships. They started shooting their cannons to the royal palace, and in about 38 minutes the war was over, because they were not prepared to face such a force. And we really wanted our main character to live that experience, and thanks to history books, we can know exactly what happened, and we were able to actually recreate it with a high level of fidelity. We know what time the bombing started, we know how the operations went, and we actually put our main character in the middle of the battle. Now, after that, some more research went into the geopolitical situation of Zanzibar. So it was the time of colonialism, so there were some attrition, let's say, between colonizing countries, such as Britain and the Germans, France. So during the course of the adventure, we meet many characters that kind of represent, in a realistic manner, the people of the time. Another interesting example is the historical figures that we put in the game. One for all is probably Alexander Fleming. Alexander Fleming was the inventor of penicillin, and thanks to him we have antibiotics now, which is pretty good because you don't live long without antibiotics. And the kind of problem is that when the game is set, Alexander Fleming was around 20-something, was a 20-something-year-old student in Delft, in the Netherlands. And the problem is we have pictures of Alexander Fleming as a grown man after his scientific discoveries, and there are maybe one or two pictures or paintings of him as a child. So what we tried to do was recreate his likeness from his childhood pictures towards his growth as an old man, and we think we kind of nailed it. But that was just one of the various things that we tried to do to keep the game realistic. For example, at some point you are traveling by boat in Egypt, and you are in Suez. And so we thought, well, you are in Egypt, why not make a stop at the pyramids? That could be interesting. So we started writing that, a short trip to the pyramids while the boat was like refilling and stuff. But then we actually took a look at the geography of Egypt, and Suez and the pyramids are not that close. Back then, the only way you could move from Suez to the pyramids was by camel, and it was a 32-hour ride by camel. So, assuming the camel never had to stop for, I don't know, to sleep or drink or eat, it would have taken 64 hours of journey back and forth, plus, let's say, some time to explore the pyramids or whatever. And it was just not realistic to expect the boat to wait for our main character during his little trip. So we just removed that part of the story, and it was a pity because we had a couple interesting ideas, but we didn't want someone to come and point out that, well, actually, you can't go there in like 3 hours, so it's not that easy. Another interesting example is at some point, our friend Jake finds himself in the British countryside and has to go back to London. So he goes to the nearest village. Well, it's a city, but it's more like a village, and finds the train tracks. So goes to the train station, and he asks when the next train is coming. And the answer is, I don't remember exactly, but it's probably something like, yeah, there is a train passing by on Monday at 11. But that day was probably like Wednesday or something. So what we actually did was we researched the train timetables of the time to try and find out when and where these trains would pass, so that it would make sense for our friend Jake to spend some time in this particular place, doing some stuff while he waited for his train, because that's something that people did 150 years ago. One of the challenges of creating Omen Exitio was probably writing in the style of Lovecraft. Not exactly writing like Lovecraft, mainly because his style is not very easy to read. He uses big words, he uses a sort of a flourish that is not very easy to read. It's not probably the right style for a video game. It would make it probably a bit too heavy, especially since it's very, well, pretty much mostly text-based. So what we did was trying to modernize the style of the writing, but without losing the general idea and the general feel. Because an interesting thing about Lovecraft is that he wasn't really aware of what he was doing when he was creating modern horror, basically. He created a branch of modern horror, which is cosmicism, which is the idea that men are tiny beings, they're speckles of dust in the infinite universe, ruled by these all-powerful monster gods. And he always thought that he was kind of plagiarizing great authors like Edgar Allan Poe. But the difference is that Poe wrote of the horror of common things, like a black cat crossing your road and then you self-destroying yourself in fear of bad luck. What Lovecraft did was something a bit different, was taking this kind of horror and mix it with dreams and with space, with cosmos, and with beings larger than men. And he didn't even realize it. He didn't think he was an accomplished author back then. And he always kind of felt like a cheat, even though he has been rediscovered lately. And many games and many books and movies and stories have been told about his mythos and his tales. So it's kind of a pity, of course, that he felt that way. He probably never was really happy with what he was doing. So what we wanted to try and do was keeping the same sense of despair and the same sense that a single man is nothing in front of this cosmic horror. And the ineffable, what cannot be known, the obscure, the darkness, the immensity of the cosmos, those are the same themes that we wanted to try and maintain. Yes, of course, sometimes we threw in a couple of words like tentacles, slithering, and stuff like that. But still, we tried to keep it a bit lighter in the style. Then, of course, there are a couple of other issues, mainly due to the fact that he was born in the 19th century, and, well, how can we say this? He was kind of racist, and also a bit sexist, probably. Which, I mean, it's not like we can blame it too much on him, like those were other times. Now, we definitely cannot write stuff with the same style and themes, although we kind of try to maintain the same sense of fear of the unknown when the British soldiers encounter black people, basically, in Zanzibar, or indigenous people from other places. They consider them savages, and they are afraid of them, even though they're not really savages. They just live a bit differently, and even though they can see that they're not really savages or cannibals, they still kind of fear these sort of animals. So, but of course, we try to keep it well, as modern as possible. Although, of course, in the late 19th century, things were definitely different. So it was a fine line to walk, making sure that the game would not offend anyone. We tried to be as respectful as possible to anyone, but still trying to maintain the same sense of danger and discovery and fear of the unknown that people at the time must have felt, and that Lovecraft told about his character. So that was definitely an interesting challenge. So it's a lot of details that helped us shape the game. So what we learned from all of this experience is, well, first of all, it's not that easy to create a choose your own adventure while you're trying to be realistic and trying to merge fiction and history. And of course, what we learned was how to actually make a choose your own adventure game, because, well, like everybody else, until you try doing something, you don't really know how to do that and how long it's going to take. It took us way more than we expected. This started as a short side project in early 2017, and we actually expected it to be done in about 3 to 4 months, 6 months tops, but it took us over a year to finish the game. And even then, it was not exactly how we wanted it to be. That's why we actually kept working on it afterwards. Um, we we made a port for Nintendo Switch with new graphics and a new user interface. We released a couple of major updates on Steam as well. We are now adding an extra chapter to the story, and we are also planning a new DLC for next year. So it still feels like something in the works. It doesn't feel like it's completely finished yet, which is good for us, because for us this is a way to experiment. Because at the beginning we just knew what we wanted to try and do, the story that we wanted to tell, and then from there we did some research. We wrote a synopsis trying to lay out the whole story, and then it was all a matter of trying to get the story to work with the real world and with choices, with game design, which was a bit of a challenge, actually. And it took a lot more effort than we initially imagined. But we're actually quite happy with it. Like, we broke even in less than a year, because it didn't cost us much to make the first game. So we broke even in about 9 months, which is pretty good for this kind of game. And with the extra revenue, we kept working and improving, and now we're working on the sequel. So we're working on Omen Exitio 2. It will have a different tagline. And we also use this experience to work on other games of a similar kind. So we're trying to kind of expand on this simple narrative games with choices, trying to make the player's choices meaningful, and keeping the focus on the narrative and trying to do something that is believable somehow on some level, but also interesting to play. So, well, what the future holds for us is basically, well, hopefully a bunch of sequels for Omen Exitio Plague. We are actually planning quite a few, and we already know where we want the story to go eventually, but it's going to take a while to get there. So it's going to be an interesting journey, and we know that it's going to be it's not going to be easy to do, because now we're trying to raise the bar with the first DLC that we are releasing now. We're trying to change a few things. We're trying to experiment a bit. The next DLC will have more gameplay elements, and we want the next game to have even more interaction, and we're changing the interface completely, because we want to try and move away from the book, from the representation of a physical book, and more towards more um, modern approaches to narrative games. So that's still something we're figuring out now. But what Omen Exitio Plague taught us is how to start working on something like that. It's something that that didn't come naturally to us because we were used to doing things a bit differently. But it's interesting to see how it played out in the end, and really hope we'll be able to take this experience and create something new and even more interesting. So that's it from Tiny Bull Studios and Omen Exitio Play. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.